and leader of his party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise on Bill 18, an act to amend the Residential Tenancies Act. On the front page of Tuesday's Times and Transcript, there was a story about a young family with an 8-month-old baby who had received notice of a $2,000 rent increase. That's over a 205% increase for their 2-bedroom apartment. Can you imagine how this 23-year-old mom and her partner must have felt? The landlord claimed it reflected increases in costs of things like garbage removal and snow clearing. The tenant wondered, though, if maybe he wanted to just get rid of them because they had made some complaints about things like snow clearing. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, the reason this happened is because the landlord could do it. There was nothing that prevented him from doing it. There's no doubt that rents are rising rapidly, and in this case, because of the publicity, the landlord revoked the rent increase. Rising rents are driving price increases across our economy. According to CMHC, the average 2-bedroom apartment rents in Moncton now rose by 9.1% in 2020. Remarkably, this was the highest increase among 37 different municipal metropolitan areas studied across the entire country. And this doesn't even account for the many increases many tenants have faced in the past 7 months since I first tabled this bill. Entre-temps, des données publiées récemment montrent que l'indice des prix à la consommation, le coût de la vie, a augmenté de 4,2% au Nouveau-Brunswick, soit un point de pourcentage de plus que la moyenne nationale. L'augmentation de 6,1% du prix des loyers, 6 fois supérieure à la moyenne nationale, y a largement contribué. Mr. Speaker, the number one issue by far for which my constituents seek help is housing. They're precariously housed, they can't afford a rent increase, the loss of child tax credits when their children age out means often they can no longer afford to stay in their home. They're being evicted because they're told their children are too noisy, they can't find affordable housing, or in some cases, especially for newcomers with larger families, they can't find any housing at all. Why is this the case? Well, New Brunswick renters have fewer legal protections than other Canadians, Mr. Speaker. That's why in 2018 I began to work on a bill to modernize the New Brunswick Residential Tenancies Act using best practices from across Canada. That initiative resulted in Bill 10 in 2018, which sought to make substantive improvements to our Residential Tenancies Act by increasing protections for our tenants. It ultimately died on the order paper as we adjourned and went to an election. However, that work was the genesis of this bill. Le rapport du gouvernement publié récemment, intitulé « Examen de la situation de logement locatif au Nouveau-Brunswick », recommandait de meilleures protections contre les augmentations de loyers déraisonnables et de limiter les augmentations de loyers à une fois par an. Ce projet de loi permettrait d'atteindre ces objectifs. Government's review of the rental landscape recommended the need to protect tenants from unreasonable rent increases and to limit those increases to once a year, and this bill would actually implement those recommendations. It's a modest bill, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't go nearly far enough to enact needed reforms to the Residential Tenancies Act in order to protect tenants from things like arbitrary evictions, to ensure they have the means to determine what their heating costs might be if they're looking at a new apartment, or to protect them against radon gas, again, if they're looking for a new apartment, to name a few things. The list is long, and government needs to bring forward a comprehensive bill to modernize the Residential Tenancies Act to better protect the rights of tenants. Our caucus doesn't have the legal resources to mount such an ambitious legislative initiative, because modernization of a piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, requires good legal advice, and the government has that, and we do not. So they must take this on. La réponse est que le gouvernement s'est largement retiré des questions de logement en 1999. Depuis les années 1970, le gouvernement du Nouveau-Brunswick a assumé la responsabilité de fournir des programmes de soutien au logement abordable au logement social, au logement coopératif, au logement sans but lucratif, à la cession à la propriété et à l'amélioration de la vie communautaire. Mr. Speaker, this was done initially for many years through NB Housing, when it operated as a standalone Crown Corp with a broad mandate, with dedicated staff and its own minister. But it was ultimately dismantled by Frank McKenna. Its mandate was somewhat continued by him in the new Department of Municipalities, Culture and Housing until 2010, when David Alward axed housing from the department altogether. Now, here we are today, with government having virtually no role in housing, that is affordable housing, thanks to the political advocates for smaller government in the past. We heard it in the chamber, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Social Development, who's been given the file to manage now by the Premier, said the affordability of housing is dictated by the market. It's not a responsibility of government. It was shortly following the snap pandemic election that I began to hear from my constituents whose rents were going up so much that they were being forced to move at a time when the chances of finding an affordable apartment is slim, and besides that, who wants to look for a new home in the middle of a pandemic? Not good. But this was new. This level of rent increases and that was happening routinely, forcing people to have to find new rental accommodations. News came in from other ridings, from other MLAs, urban and rural, that constituents were experiencing the same thing. New owners of buildings were hiking rents, demanding unreasonable, unjustifiable increases in the face of an affordable housing crisis. Le premier à s'exprimer a été William Morissette de Moncton. Le 1er octobre, il a reçu un avis l'informant que son loyer allait augmenter de 460 $, soit une hausse de 62%. Lorsqu'il l'a appris, elle a déclaré « Je ne pensais même pas que c'était légal, mais apparemment, ils peuvent le faire ». Son choc a été partagé par de nombreuses personnes au Nouveau-Brunswick lorsqu'elles ont découvert que rien n'empêche les propriétaires d'augmenter les loyers autant qu'ils le veulent et aussi souvent qu'ils le veulent, pourvu qu'ils donnent un préavis de 3 mois. It turns out that his experience was really just the tip of the iceberg. On November the 23rd, Bernadette McGregor of Leakin received a notice that her rent would be increasing from $800 to $1,200, a 50% jump. In December, Stephanie Killam of Moncton was forced to move when she could no longer afford the rent for the apartment she shared with her mother after it was increased by 50%. In the beginning, the Premier put it down to isolated anecdotes. The Minister of Service in New Brunswick said that such steep rent increases are rare and not something the government needs to regulate. The Minister of Social Development insisted this was the market at work and we should leave it alone, and that government should be the last resort for housing. According to him, it's not government's concern if people are forced out of their homes because of the market creating unreasonable rent increases. It's just the invisible hand of the market doing what it's supposed to be doing. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's why government regulation actually exists. We all know that. Because the invisible hand of the market has no conscience, it has no soul, it has no ethics, it simply seeks to maximize profit, which drives endless growth, consumption, without concern for social well-being or, for that matter, environmental limits. Government's involvement in housing over the years has largely shrunk to managing social housing that was built prior to 1990, and none has been built since, and providing subsidies for privately owned apartments to house individuals and families on social assistance. Since institutionally no one, so to speak, in government owns the affordable housing responsibility, it's no wonder our Residential Tenancies Act has not kept up with similar legislation across the country. Le logement est un droit de la personne. La Déclaration universelle des droits de la personne dont nous sommes signataires comprend le droit à un logement adéquat sans discrimination. The clerk of the Legislative Council's review of the rental landscape highlighted the fact that housing is a right, but also says housing is a business, with housing being built, sold, and rented as a service according to demand. Well, Mr. Speaker, oops. Eh bien, le logement est aussi une entreprise sociale avec un résultat social, avec des logements coopératifs et des logements sans but lucratif. C'est aussi un service public avec les logements sociaux. Et c'est un complément de revenus pour certains, pas un exercice de maximisation du profit. For example, Mr. Speaker, people rent out basement apartments to help with their mortgage payments or to supplement their pensions. My grandparents, for years, rented a room to students to supplement their pensions. My grandfather sold shoes all his life, and they didn't have much of a pension to live off of. My grandmother rented a basement apartment from her sister-in-law after she was widowed. Her mom turned her house into a boarding house when she was widowed in middle age. My mother has lived in a number of cooperative apartments, which she found quite affordable and socially quite positive, because everyone was involved in the decisions that were made about their homes, the apartments that they rented within the cooperative housing complex. Government's involvement in housing has largely shrunk, as I said. So that's a major concern, Mr. Speaker. The situation I outline of co-ops and nonprofit housing, of people renting rooms out or renting basement apartments or half of the duplex they own or maybe a secondary duplex that they own, is far removed as one can get from Bay Street real estate income trusts looking to generate profits from their further investors from renting apartments in New Brunswick. The review of the rental landscape report quotes the UN on this: the human right to adequate housing is more than just four walls and a roof. It's the right of every woman, man, youth and child to gain and sustain a safe and secure home and a community in which to live in peace and dignity. Because we are talking about people's homes. Yes, they rent them, so they have actually no property rights, as it were, but as tenants, they have a right to a safe and secure home in which to live in dignity, free from things like black mold, which is a common concern brought to me, free from radon gas, free from discrimination, free from arbitrary eviction, and free from unreasonable rent increases, which this bill intends to address. My bill doesn't go nearly far enough, but it would free tenants from unreasonable rent increases. If that can be achieved before we adjourn for summer, we will have taken a step to increasing security tenants have in the homes they have made in rental properties. This doesn't prevent landlords from raising rents on empty apartments following a rent eviction or following an arbitrary eviction, and that's an issue. The government's rental landscape report found that 42% of landlords raise their rents for new tenants once the apartments are empty, and government must address this. So what does the bill actually do? Well, it provides government with the legal authority to define an allowable rate of rent increase. It doesn't specify what it is in the bill, it just provides them with that authority. This is already the case in British Columbia, Manitoba, Ontario, and Prince Edward Island. The bill then prohibits a landlord from raising the rent they charge by more than the allowable rate, which would be provided for in regulation, not specified in this bill, and prohibits more than a single rent increase in a year. That's what it does. Le Nouveau-Brunswick est la seule province qui promet plus d'une augmentation de loyer par année. Incroyable. L'examen du gouvernement de paysage locatif n'a pas fait beaucoup de recommandations, mais il a recommandé de mettre fin à cette pratique. Ce projet de loi garantirait la mise en œuvre immédiate de cette recommandation. What else does this bill do, Mr. Speaker? Well, it provides for landlords the ability to apply to the Chief Residential Tenancies Officer for an order permitting the rent charge to be increased by more than the allowable rate if the landlord incurs either extraordinary increases as prescribed by regulation in the cost of municipal taxes or charges for the premises or building in which the premises are located, or if there's an eligible capital expenditure as prescribed by regulation respecting the premises or the building in which the premises are located. So if there's justifiable increased costs that would cause a rent increase above what's deemed allowable, then they can apply for that. Much more needs to be done, but this legislature can adopt this bill this spring to protect tenants from unreasonable rent increases as recommended by the Clerk of the Executive Council in her report review of the rental landscape. So they'll be protected this year. Her report, when you review it, found there is a gap between what people need and what we have on the rental market. She found our housing market is not working for everyone. She found New Brunswickers are making hard choices to stay housed. She found that New Brunswickers feel unprotected. She found that developing affordable housing is full of roadblocks. And she found that rural communities have unique challenges in this regard. And I would add that people with children feel discriminated against when they're looking for apartments or rent apartments. And I've had many who've been evicted under the auspices that their children were making too much noise. And of course, tenants fear arbitrary eviction, Mr. Speaker, and that's one of the reasons that they tend not to complain. They tend not to go to the tenancies folks to raise concerns over a rent increase or black mold in their apartment or what have you, because they're fearful that they will be evicted because if you have a year-to-year lease, you can be evicted without any real reason at all. As I said, arbitrary evictions are a problem. So, Mr. Speaker, there's much to be done, and urgently. As we don't have a Minister of Housing, and New Brunswick Housing Corp is now really just a paper entity, the Premier has given the responsibility for addressing the crisis in affordable housing to the Minister of Social Development. On top of all of the other responsibilities he has for the third largest department in the government, with multiple responsibilities from child protection and adult protection to social assistance and his social housing, housing stock, and on, seniors and long-term care, Mr. Speaker. But he has been given that responsibility. The Minister says he will respond to the Clerk of the Executive Council's report by Monday. Well, he said by the end of the month, and that's Monday. So we won't have to wait long to see what his plan is for ending things like arbitrary evictions, modernizing the Residential Tenancies Act, and supporting the development of more affordable housing. However, he doesn't have to worry about protecting people from unreasonable rent increases or more than one rent increase in a year if he and his colleagues simply vote for this bill. That will be done. That job will be done by this bill. It's not new or unusual. Other provinces, as I said, including our neighbour right across the bridge in Prince Edward Island, already do it. What is unusual, though, is we do actually stand alone in the country, in the entire country of Canada, in allowing multiple rent increases in a single year, and this bill will get rid of that. So I ask my colleagues on both sides of the House to do the right thing and support this bill so that it can get through committee stage and be presented for third reading before we adjourn for the summer to protect tenants in this province from unreasonable increases in rent and from more than a single rent increase within a single calendar year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.